2020, Spotify wired Joe Rogan approximately $200 million, not for music, not for journalism, for three men sitting in a room, talking. The executives who signed that check weren't buying content. They were buying an audience that legacy media couldn't explain, couldn't replicate, and couldn't stop growing. Young men, increasingly disconnected, increasingly furious, tuning in by the millions, and someone had figured out exactly what they needed to hear. This is unpriced risk. Everything made sense, right up until it didn't. The real question was never the money. It was who decided that the frustration of young men was worth $200 million and what they understood that everyone else was pretending not to notice. Here's the thing. Spotify's analysts knew the demographic breakdown. They knew the engagement numbers. They knew what those listeners did after an episode ended. The people most alarmed by young male anger in 2020 were writing op-eds. The people least alarmed were writing checks. Same data, completely different conclusions about what it was worth. One group saw a social problem, the other saw a product, and the product group had already run the numbers long before anyone else had finished drafting their think piece. That gap between who was worried and who was paying is what we're actually following here. Not the podcast, not the host, the gap. The people who built the largest platforms for male grievance content weren't angry young men. They were analysts, tracking watch time curves on spreadsheets in Menlo Park, California. Not a single one of them angry. That's the thread connecting Spotify's 2020 calculation to everything that came before it. Not ideology, not outrage, a curve on a dashboard that kept pointing up. Back in 2018, YouTube's internal researchers had already documented what their recommendation algorithm was doing to male viewers specifically. Portions of those findings leaked in 2021. What we found in them was straightforward and uncomfortable. The platform was pushing viewers toward progressively more extreme content, not because anyone programmed it to radicalize people, but because outrage produced longer session times. Longer session times produced higher ad revenue, and higher ad revenue was the number everyone in the building was paid to grow. The algorithm didn't have a politics. It had a preference for whatever kept a 24-year-old in Ohio from closing the tab. Now follow the money out. The top 10 so-called red pill channels on YouTube, content telling men that feminism, progressive culture, or the economy itself had deliberately targeted them, collectively generated an estimated $100 million in ad revenue between 2016 and 2022. The actual figure may be higher, since significant revenue moved through channels that were demonetized mid-period and then reinstated. Most of it came from mainstream brands, consumer goods, insurance, meal kits, companies that had no idea their ads were running there. A protein powder company in suburban Atlanta was, without knowing it, funding content telling young men their futures had been stolen. Nobody in that chain intended the outcome. Everyone in that chain got paid. But the dashboard in Menlo Park didn't create that audience. It found one that had been forming for years before anyone thought to put a price on it. Back in 2012, Joe Rogan was recording in a spare room, 3 hours at a stretch, with comedians and fighters and scientists who couldn't get booked on television. No producers, no format, no demographic targeting. By 2015, his show was the most downloaded podcast in the United States, and the audience it had built had nothing to do with any algorithm. It was a constituency. Men without college degrees, working jobs that paid less in real terms than the same jobs had paid their fathers. Between 2000 and 2020, real median wages for men without a 4-year degree fell by approximately 10% after accounting for inflation. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a slow, grinding, decade-long confirmation that the deal they'd been promised wasn't coming through. Rogan didn't invent that feeling. He was the first major host to treat it as something other than a character flaw. 3 hours, no commercial interruption, wherever the conversation went, and the men listening felt, maybe for the first time in a long time, that someone wasn't talking down to them. That was the product, not outrage, recognition the talent agencies noticed. By 2019, Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist turned podcast host, along with Lex Fridman, an AI researcher with a quietly growing interview show, and a whole cohort of second-generation hosts in the same informal orbit, had each independently signed with major talent agencies. What had been a loose content category became a packaged media vertical. Standardized sponsorship rates, quarterly deliverables. The packaging happened faster than anyone in the industry seemed to expect. as if the infrastructure had been waiting for exactly this content to arrive. Then, look at which sponsors moved in: testosterone supplements, firearms accessories, VPN services, trading apps. The categories look unrelated. They aren't. They map onto the same audience profile, and they got packaged before most people even noticed there was a category to package. By 2023, the audience had been built. The sponsors had moved in. The only question left was which direction the money would flow next. The answer came in the form of a presidential campaign. The 2024 Trump campaign made the largest known allocation to podcast and influencer appearances of any presidential campaign in history, trading television budgets for a format that Rogan had spent 15 years building. Men who'd spent a decade feeling talked down to by every major institution were now the most valuable media real estate in the country. Someone in a campaign war room had done that math long before the primaries were over. The single largest individual placement, a 3-hour appearance on Rogan's show in October 2024. No moderator, no fact-check crawl, no commercial break pulling the audience out of the room, just the format and a campaign that understood exactly what that format was worth. The ad buying wasn't routed through Rogan alone. Significant spending moved through Rumble, an alternative video platform that had received early investment from Peter Thiel and JD Vance in 2021, specifically to capture the audience YouTube had been quietly removing from its ad program. Rumble's stock rose nearly 190% across 2024, with its sharpest gains following the November election and a 9-figure investment announced in December. The timing wasn't coincidental. The hosts made their own choices. Each one had spent years positioning themselves as anti-establishment voices, and each one accepted campaign advertising at rates well above their standard sponsorship floor. Nobody forced that decision. It was a price, and they named it, and the campaign paid it. Then we tally the room. Thiel's fund collected. Rumble's early shareholders collected. The hosts collected. The campaign got the placement. Every party to the transaction got exactly what they came for, except the men in the audience, who were about to find out what they'd actually purchased. The election was over by November 2024. The receipts took a little longer to arrive. By January 2026, the Harvard Institute of Politics had a number. They'd been tracking this cohort for over a year. 27%. That's the share of young men who voted for Trump and said, 14 months later, that he was delivering for them. Less than a third. Less than a third of buyers felt they'd received what was advertised. Now hold that number next to this one. Joe Rogan's net worth, as of 2026, is approximately $250 million. The man whose platform Spotify paid 9 figures to license in 2020, who spent years sitting across from guests in that studio, validating the feeling that the economy had been rigged against ordinary men, is himself worth more than most of his listeners will accumulate across several lifetimes combined. The frustration made one person rich, and it wasn't the frustrated, which is worth sitting with for a moment. Because what we're looking at isn't a betrayal, it's a business model, an old one, repackaged with better analytics. The sponsors who followed that audience didn't need the anger resolved, they needed it maintained. The revenue model required the grievance to stay open, not inflamed to the point of paralysis, not resolved to the point of satisfaction, just alive enough that the next product felt like the answer the last one almost was. There's no conspiracy in that. No secret meeting, no coordinated plan, just a business model where the customer's problem is worth more unsolved than solved, and nobody in the room gets paid to notice the difference. The incentives handle everything. They always do. 6 weeks after the election results came in, Rumble announced a $775 million investment from Tether. 14 months later, a Harvard poll showed nearly 3 in 4 young Trump voters felt the deal hadn't delivered. The investment didn't wait for those results. It didn't need to. The audience's disappointment wasn't a problem anyone in this industry needed to solve. It was a gap to fill with something new, something that hadn't yet spent its credibility. The pipeline doesn't pause for a bad quarter. It retools. What the continued investment confirms is that the people writing checks have decided that audience is still there, still reachable, and still willing to pay for the feeling that someone finally gets it. The faces will change. The format will update. But the gap between what a society promises young men and what it actually delivers stays exactly where it was, because nobody in this pipeline gets paid to close it. There's no named villain in any of the term sheets. There doesn't need to be. It works more like a vending machine than a conspiracy. Someone loads it, someone else presses the button. The mechanism doesn't particularly care why you're hungry. The men funding the next wave of content, one subscription and one supplement purchase at a time, are probably the last to know they're funding it. The real question isn't who built this, it's what it would cost to build a media economy where male economic pain was treated as a problem to be solved rather than an audience to be retained. And why, in 2026, nobody with the capital to try has tried. The discovery that young men feel betrayed isn't a warning to the industry, it's a new product brief. The brief went out in January, no one had to write it down. The money was already moving before anyone named what it was moving toward. Thanks for watching Unpriced Risk. Hit subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.